Good morning, party people. Welcome to Office Hours, the webcast where I take your questions from Poll Gab there on the screen, the ones that you've top voted, and answer those in the order that they were voted, which is important to say here because today is a webcast with some really good questions that demand really long answers and some that are like 10 seconds and I'm out. And it's going to be kind of fun to see those because I went through the list of top voted questions right before we started and I was like, I see what's going on here. Sometimes I think that people like try to multiple upvote their own questions because I'm like, there's no way anybody upvoted this question. Hello to Jim Van Allen, to the Kazakh, to Far SQL. The Kazakh says, is it Wednesday already? My body clock, my like days is so screwed up. Eve and I went for a long weekend in Telluride and ended up there from like Thursday last week to yesterday. Drove back yesterday. SQL Pilot, welcome back and thank you for the 21 months. Very cool, almost 2 years there. So it was about a 9-hour drive if you just fly, if you just go right through. But it's gorgeous scenery, and I like stopping all the time. Plus, we had the dog with us. We had Beanie with us. So I think it took us around about 11 or 12 hours to do the trip. Bobo Gator, first time chat. Hello. He says first time catching you live. I always like doing these live too. I recorded one in Telluride from the balcony. It's the energy's totally different when I do them live or when I do them recorded. I noticed that when I finished with the webcast when I was recorded, I was like, "Ugh, I'm kind of in a grumpy mood," and I think a lot of my answers were probably grumpy because sometimes when you read those and there aren't people there to laugh along with you, you're like, "Oh God, whose idea of a good question was this?" So let's take a look at what we got in the question queue. The top voted one, which I got to look and see because you might have changed it based on your upvoting. AI says, as DBAs, how can we best prepare for the AI world in terms of data? AI is a front end thing. Data tends to be more of a back end thing. So what do I mean by that? AI is kind of like C# or Java in the sense that it's a way that you ask questions of the data. As a DBA, which is what this question asks, you probably don't have to do anything. If you were a developer, I'd give you totally different answers. But as of 2023, there's nothing really that you need to do for an AI. Prepare yourself for AI accessing the data. The closest that I could come to an answer here would be to say, get ready to have even worse queries thrown at the data than you have today. It's kind of like just like somebody writing their own queries with AI is the vision of it down the road, at which point it's going to be just like those of us who've had to manage business objects or any of those Power BI ad hoc queries where any yo-yo can drag and drop things and all of a sudden I have a catastrophic performance problem because someone wrote a really crappy query against the database. So your career is in really good shape. Next up, Tim asks, what is the best method for configuring Linux or Kubernetes to connect to failover clusters with multi-subnet failover equals true? Stop. Tim, you're mixing and matching technologies. You don't need multi-subnet failover equals true for failover clustered instances. You only need it when you're dealing with availability groups with members in different subnets. You shouldn't be doing that inside of failover clustered instances. I can see how theoretically someone would think that it would be possible, like you would have two nodes of the same failover cluster in two totally different subnets. That's going to be where your heartaches begin. That's not a really good idea for a failover type configuration because you want them physically right next to each other. There are third-party tools like Sios Data Keeper that will allow you to keep disparate members of a cluster in sync, where you can have them in two different data centers. Like theoretically, you can run failover clustered instances in Amazon on top of Amazon EC2 or Azure VMs. I don't really like where that's going. I haven't had good experiences with that. But it sounds like that's what you might be trying to do, in which case hit the brakes, maybe go back to a more normal failover clustered instance that has all of its members inside the same subnet. Next up, Jorge says, what are your pros and cons of deleting old backup files for multi-terabyte backups? Okay, so here's the thing. You asked about Ola Hollengren's backup scripts. As soon as someone hits the 1 terabyte mark for databases, I am not a fan of native backups. I'm a fan of snapshot backups, like SAN snapshot backups that will get nice, clean copies of your database that works in conjunction with log backups for most of the vendors too as well. So if you're going to ask me what my big overall strategy is, it's snapshot backups, which takes this question out of the realm altogether. But where it sounds like you're going is you're trying to do multi-terabyte backups, and it sounds like you're trying to delete a successful backup before you take one. When you're climbing up on mountains, what they tell you to do is you always have one hand on your old destination and one hand on your new destination. Like if you're getting ready to move from one place to another, but you want both of those held on at the same time. You never want to let go of your old destination at the same time that you're reaching for the new destination. That's when your heartache begins. Similarly, I wouldn't want to delete a good backup before I knew that I had another good backup. So go ahead and get that. Jim says he likes the shirt. I like this too quite a bit. Colors are great too. Bekim says, do you recommend page or row compression for new tables in SQL Server? I don't have a problem with someone using those. It's just never been the thing that got me across the finish line by itself. So I'm fine if people use them. I'm also fine if they don't. Michael J. Swartz says that climbing analogy is great. Did you come up with that on the fly? Yes. I happen to be watching a DJ or a production company called Circle, Cercle. Circle does DJ videos on these incredible destinations, on cliffs, on mountains, on glaciers, and they'll have DJ parties out there. Sometimes there's no one there, sometimes there are hundreds of people there. But see, I had cliffs fresh in my mind from watching a Circle video. That's where that came from. Next up, Miles says, hi Brent, the app suddenly grew from 3 terabytes to 5 terabytes, filling up the disk. How do I size the data and log files for such sudden growths? I'm less worried about the files. I'm more worried about the drives, of course, because you can run out of drive space. The problem for me is it sounds like you're on something that's got rigid size hard caps, like you can't automatically grow the drives. In every current version of VMware, in every current version of Hyper-V, in every current cloud provider, you have the ability to automatically grow volumes when they fill up. So my guess is you don't have that configured. That's where you want to go, because it's less about how to size them and it's more about knowing to turn that switch on wherever you have your storage at to automatically grow volumes. Now, when the volume grows, that's when you want to set alerts, like perhaps every time that the volume grows by X percentage, then you trigger an email to the DBA team or the sysadmins who can then work with the stakeholders. After the growth alarm hits, I love doing SP Blitz Index, get all databases equals 1, sort by size, sort by size. All you have to do is say sort by equals size. And then that'll give you your largest to smallest objects. That way you can go to the app team and say, okay, check this out. Here are the sizes of the objects that we have. Is this what y'all expected? So then they can go, oh my gosh, we didn't know about that table grew overnight or whatever it is. So there you go. Next up, Hjordis asks, is it okay to delete from a CTA CTE instead of a view when doing fast ordered deletes? Hjordis, I bet you're asking because you looked at my blog post on fast ordered deletes. Read the whole thing, including the comments. I know it's hard to believe that my readers would ever have anything intelligent to say, but every now and then, as my grandfather would say, even a blind squirrel can get a nut. In that post, there are several good comments in there that talk about this exact thing. Reason I'm telling you that instead of telling you what the answer is I think it's an important life lesson for you to learn. As an author, it is not pleasurable. Oh, got some of my breakfast there on my shirt. It is not pleasurable in any way, shape, or form for me to read the comments because often they are terrible. But as a reader, that's something that you want to do whenever you're reading blog posts. Because often the comments disagree on the stuff that's in the post, and they give reasons why. Or they'll say, this is outdated because of this, this, and this. And if you don't see answers back from the blogger, that also kind of tells you that maybe that's not, that content has passed its expiration date. Next up, Don't Bother Asking says, do you advocate using storage replication as a data resiliency and availability strategy? Yes, absolutely. Does replication at the storage level work with SQL Server? Yes, absolutely. Work with your storage admins to test, to configure it, test it, failover back and forth so that you feel comfortable about that. One of my favorite ways to do that is set up a brand new SQL Server that isn't production, but feels like production. You're going to treat it like production. And then you're going to replicate it over to the secondary data center. You're going to put an agent job in there that runs continuously, and it updates one row in a table, just setting the date time to be current. So that way, when you fail over, you can make a note of what time the primary server was at the failover, then go look over at the secondary, and you can see how far behind it is. That'll give you a feeling for how much data you lost in the event of a disaster. Now, when we're first setting this up, there's no other activity happening on that SQL server other than that agent job. So it's going to give you kind of your best case scenario of how close you could be. Then you're going to put like a 10 gigabyte table in that database. And in another agent job, you're going to continuously rebuild its indexes, which is a very time intensive operation. It's a log intensive operation. It's a disk intensive operation. And then when you fail over to the secondary, over to DR with SAN replication, you're going to see how much further behind it is. And that'll give you something closer to a worst case scenario. So there you go. I say there you go a lot, but there you go. Miles says, hi Brent, please explain how RCSI works. Miles, wouldn't that be cool? If inside of the span of 30 seconds or 60 seconds, I could teach you how something like versioning works. All right, Miles, start the clock. Let's see how we do. Got to copy the data in your data file. This is the main database that you usually think about. What's going to happen is every time you do an update or a delete of that, SQL Server is going to go copy a version of it somewhere else so that while your lock is being held on, people can look over at the version store and see a version of your data before your locking happened. That way, your writers can be over here in the main database making their changes, and your readers can bypass those locks by hitting the version store. Now, he said, unable to visualize how all this works. Hopefully, that was enough to get you across the finish line. If it's not, I'm going to take your money. Go attend my Fundamentals of tempdb class, which doesn't sound like it's related to RCSI, but it actually is. I explain the version store inside there, when it lives in the user databases, when it lives in tempdb, what it's used for, things like cursors, triggers, all kinds of things. That's my Fundamentals of tempdb class. And you belong in fundamentals. I don't mean that personally. It's just the word fundamentals has a U in it. So that's what I'm trying to say there. Next up, RacerX says, what's the fastest you've ever driven and which car was it in? Okay, so there are two answers. One is the answer on public roads. I can't give you that answer for what should be obvious reasons, like it would be bad to incriminate yourself. I can tell you that it was in a Jaguar XKRS hardtop. Mine, the one that I used to own, I sold it. The second answer is what happens, and it was in the United States because the Kazakh asks, follows up with which country was it in, because you could say it was Germany on the Autobahn. I've been on the Autobahn in an E-Class, and I have gone well over U.S. speed limits. I want to say it was like 130 miles an hour U.S. I don't remember what the kilometers an hour was on the Autobahn. I took a red-eye flight, hopped into a rental car, and then proceeded to beat the bejesus out of an E-Class station wagon, which was probably a bad idea. The other answer is not on public roads, and I can't give you that answer either because I don't know what the number was. But there's this thing called the Andretti Experience outside of Chicago, and it's probably in other places too as well, where they put you in a Formula One car or an Indy car style of cars, and it's a tandem seat, so the real driver's in the front, if I remember right. I think he was in the front and then I was in the back. Now I can't remember which one was in the front, come to think of it. And probably the reason why is because I was looking over at the wall so much, scared out of my mind. So you go at maybe 130, 150 miles an hour. It's not even really that fast in the grand scheme of things, but it's fast enough to scare the hell out of you when you're the only car on the track and the guy's going right up against the wall and then diving in for the corners. That I was like, my heart was pounding out of my chest the whole time. My neck was dealing with the pains of trying to keep my head up with the insane cornering forces. And it gave me a whole new appreciation for racing because I can't even imagine trying to do that while there are other cars on the track with you, everybody fighting wheel to wheel, trying to get ahead as much as they possibly can. That was very eye-opening. Was messing with my eyes there, but that was totally unrelated. Urs Fischer says, have you seen any successful code migrations from SQL Server to Postgres for money-saving purposes? No. Remember at the start of the webcast, I said that some of the answers were real quick and some of them were real drawn out. This is a quick answer. No. Because think of the biggest SQL Server that you've ever worked with. Then think of all the developers that would be needed to port that code over from SQL Server to Postgres for that application, because it's probably been around for a really long time. So it's going to take a whole hell of a lot of work in order to move that over. Compare those two, compare the SQL Server licensing cost versus the developer cost, and then think about how much risk is involved with the developer cost. So I have never seen anyone migrate across. I have seen companies say, all right, we're going to build the new version of our application and we're going to redo the entire back end at the exact same time. Those projects are almost never for money-saving purposes. It's because the company had so much technical debt that the application didn't work the way they wanted them to, where they couldn't hire developers for that old language or whatever. But it isn't just to save money on SQL Server licensing. Next up, planCacheObliteration asks a question. We've got batched queries below, and this poor person tried to give me examples of queries inside a PolGab. I can't do that. When you get to the point where you need to show someone queries, that's where consulting comes in. And as bad as my answers are publicly for free, I know you find it hard to believe that anyone would actually shell out money to pay me for knowledge. But believe it or not, they do. And this is one of your signs that it's time to do that. If this is causing enough of a pain for you, and I don't think it is, but if it's causing enough of a pain for you that the business is ready to shell out for consulting, go to brentozar.com and click on consulting up at the top, and then that way you can go hire me for getting answers to questions like these. To give you a rough idea, the smallest consulting engagement that I start new clients with is my 2-day SQL critical care for $7,000 US. Most companies are done with that. Most companies say, okay, I've got everything that I need out of that engagement. That's going to keep my developers busy for months. So don't think of it as, oh my God, that's only the entry point. That's actually also the finishing line for almost every project that I'm engaged in. Every now and then people will say, oh my gosh, we had no idea how much we were up against. Now we're going to hire you for a longer term. And that goes on for a little while too. But most of the time, that $7,000 package is one and done. Next up, let's see here. Confusing DBA says, "Hi Brent, we ran into performance issues recently. We used steps from the first responder kit to teach our developers to solve those issues, but they only want direct answers and spoon-fed solutions, and they like to ask random questions. How do you like to suggest, or how do you suggest to deal with this?" That's what they're paying you for. That's what they're paying you for. You're the database administrator. What do you think administration means? Buckle up and do the work they're paying you for. And if you don't like that, go find a new job. Go figure. Next up, we have Miles. Miles says, "We have a vendor-specific database and we have a lot of query hints being used in their codes. Is this fine, or do we need to ask the developers to remove those hints? In recent times with multiple integrations, this database is becoming slow." Okay, so I don't think that you've done a good job of tying "it's slow because of this." It is possible. I've seen cases where update lock hints or row lock hints have used a staggering amount of memory, and that's been the root cause of why SQL Server was slow. I don't get the feeling that you're doing that root cause analysis. Here's what I would suggest doing. Run spblitz first with the parameter thence startup equals 1. And that'll tell you your SQL Server's wait times since that thing started up. Investigate what the top couple of waits are and then go from there. And I teach you how to do that in my Mastering Server Tuning class, but just that advice first, maybe the point that I've not seen a lot of cases, like maybe less than 5 in my lifetime, where those hints were the root cause of why the SQL Server was slow. Next up, we have Mike, who asks, "In Azure SQL Managed Instance, should I still perform DBCC CheckDB checks?" You know who you should ask for this is Microsoft. They don't seem to be giving you good answers, do they? They don't seem to tell you whether or not you should run CheckDB. If Microsoft can't tell me, I don't know that I know either. So me being a paranoid DBA, I mean DBA stands for all kinds of things. One of the things people joke about is doesn't believe anyone. I would run it. Because what happens if there's a bug in SQL Server? And if you don't know whether or not that's happening, go check out the recent release notes for cumulative updates for SQL Server. And they go on for pages. There are actually bugs out there about data corruption in SQL Server 2022. Then go compare those release notes to Azure SQL Managed Instance. Go look at all of the corruption bugs. What's that you say? You can't find the release notes for Azure SQL Managed Instance? They're not breaking out which bugs they fix and when they come out? Oh, that's right. So you're talking about a database platform when you don't know which bugs there are, what bugs there are, and when they fix them, or what they've done, or how the query behavior has changed. That sounds like the kind of place where I would really want to run CheckDB, right? Like it's even less predictable and explainable than SQL Server is. So I'm totally down with still running CheckDB there as well. Next up, on a related note, Mike asks, in Azure, SQL Managed Instances cost, let's say, $8,000 a month for a given size compared to a VM. And he says, Azure SQL Managed Instance is cheaper. Isn't Managed Instance supposed to be more expensive given that backups, patching, and HA are taken care of by Azure? My guess is that you're comparing one instance in Managed Instances with no failover. Like you're not getting a high availability partner. Now, you said HA is taken care of by Azure. Availability is taken care of by Azure, not necessarily what you and I might call high availability. It can and will go down just like a single VM will. Now, they do much better at availability than you or I do with a single VM, but I don't want to put too much stock in that. I don't think you're really comparing apples to apples there. But make sure that you compare those two apples to apples, and then you'll find different costs. The other thing I would say too is very often in Azure's portals, they'll say this price includes license flexibility or whatever, like you're going to port your existing SQL Server licenses over to Azure, which really what that means is, hey, Azure SQL Managed Instances is way cheaper if you don't include the licensing. But then when you go into the licensing, you get a totally different factor. Another way that that can hit is VMs are often priced without reservations and assuming that you rent your licenses by the hour. You can get reservations, you can purchase your licensing for extended periods of time. So make sure you factor all of those in. Next up, let's see here. Ornella asks, what are the top use cases for SQL synonyms that you see in the wild? Far and away, the one big one is you need to move an object from one place to another, like you need to move it from one database to another, and then that way you can leave a pointer behind in the old location. Now, Gustav says SQL Managed Instances is not mature yet. Avoid for another 2 years at least. I'm going to disagree. I'm going to say that managed instances are more mature than not having a database administrator and not having any high availability or disaster recovery yourself. I know in here, a lot of us are used to being full-time database administrators. We're used to doing a lot of care and feeding to our servers, and we may have a standard, and we may feel that Microsoft isn't up to that standard yet. But for people with no DBAs, it's a slam dunk. It's a much better, I would say Azure SQL DB, Azure SQL DB Managed Instances, Amazon RDS, Google Cloud SQL, all of those are better for when you don't have a database administrator. Gustav follows up with fair enough. He says it is easier, but man, I love being in control. Let me translate for you. What Gustav really said was, yes, those other platforms are easier, but I like a salary. Gustav, I hear you. I don't blame you, but make sure you put that disclaimer in when you sell something. Hey, this one over here is much easier. Oh, and by the way, it also comes with my salary. It's a little tricky there. Next up, Tim Taylor says, what's it like living in a new house during major renovations? Would you do it again? You know, it's one of those questions where if I won the Mega Millions lottery, my answer would be very different. If I had an unlimited amount of funds, then absolutely I would have one house that I build from scratch, would be exactly the way that I want it. And while it's being built, I would live somewhere else. But because I'm not that wealthy, I do have to live in the house as we're working on it to make it exactly what we want. We just finished building the bar in the home theater. I say finished. I have to paint the front of the bar, but other than that, it's off and running. And then we'll do one more. Let's see here. Q-Ent says, hi, Brent, do you have any suggestions on how we can update our data warehouse in near real time from our staging environment? What? Oh, staging. My first thought when you said staging was I thought like prep code, like you were changing code, testing code in a staging environment. It says, I use transactional replication right now, but the amount of changes is too high and causes performance issues on our distribution database. I've never seen people try to use replication to keep a data warehouse up to sync. The place where I would start is I would start with Andy Leonard of EntDNA, EntDNA.com, for like enterprise DNA. And he teaches you how to use tools like Azure Data Factory, SQL Server integration services, and I don't think replication is going to be the solution that gets you across the finish line. Load the data where you need it. Tools like SSIS and Azure Data Factory are great at dumping data in quickly. But when you say real-time replication, I get a little nervous because that's kind of sketchy in terms of performance. Every time someone inserts, updates, or deletes a sale, I want to immediately have it in the data warehouse. Then just query the source system. What's the warehouse for? I think you misunderstood what a data warehouse is. All right, so we'll stop there. Today we had a lot of interesting, fun, wild questions. If you have a moment, go through the remaining questions on PullGab and upvote the ones you'd like to see me discuss next week. Tomorrow, I may do a Dead by Daylight stream. We'll see how that's going. I got the PC all set to go. I've got the camera in there. My microphone's all set up. So we may see how that goes. I may crash and burn. We'll have some learning time that we do tomorrow. So see y'all tomorrow on Office Hours. Adios.